guys, you're welcome back. My name is Bukumi Pikikran. Thank you so much for clicking.
Okay, so let me get into maybe some of the issues here with you. Since you read the Quran, you said 2 or 3 times at this point, right? And you read the Book of Mormon, and we'll get to that because I'm curious to know where you're going to go with that. The Quran, after you read the book the first time, what was your impression? Did you say, oh, wow, complete different understanding than what I thought was going to be in the Book of Quran? This is actually a great book. I actually enjoyed this. I actually learned this. What was your impression at the end?
I mean, have you ever read the Quran?
I've never read the book.
Okay, so the Quran is interesting in that when you come to it, especially if you're a Christian and you're expecting things to be chronological, and when you open up a Bible, Genesis...
Structured.
Right. Genesis says, in the beginning, and that's in the beginning, and by the time you get to the end, Revelation is the end, right? The Quran is structured differently in that the biggest chapters are at the beginning and the smallest chapters are at the end. So there's 114 surahs or chapters in the Quran, and the way that it's been put together and structured is very, very different than something like the Bible, in that it's not in a narrative theme or a chronological theme, but it's on the basis of the chapters. And there are various reasons for that in terms of the overall way that the Quran eventually got codified. Because during Muhammad's lifetime, the Quran was oral. And actually, there was a hesitancy after Muhammad died in 632, I believe it was. Muhammad dies. I could be wrong on that date. I'm just going off the top of my head. Muhammad dies, and actually the Muslims who are following him have a hesitancy to write it down because Muhammad never told them to write it down. But there's this process that eventually gets put into place because Muhammad's successors in the caliphs realize that people have memorized the Quran differently. And so there is...
What does that mean? Memorize the Quran differently?
Yeah. So you had these individuals who were following Muhammad around and they were memorizing everything he was saying. And so part of this process is that people were remembering things slightly differently. And I believe it was so Abu Bakr, who I think is the second rightly guided caliph in the succession after Muhammad, he's the person who starts the process of kind of bringing together all of these recitations of the Quran. And then that's finalized under a later caliph by the name of Uthman. And Uthman, I think when they come to Abu Bakr, the statement literally that they say is, save us before we differ like the Christians and the Jews before us. And that they saw that there were some things that the Christians and the Jews were disagreeing on between their written texts, and they didn't want that to happen with the Quran. And so there's a period of time under Uthman where it's called the Uthmanic revision, where he gathers all of these documents together, all of these different recitations, and he codifies it into one document and he destroys all of the differing ones. So in that sense, you do have a standardized version, but it's in terms of like the history of how texts are produced and disseminated, it's what's called a controlled transmission. It's essentially a government oversight of it, right? So the great thing about having only one version is that you don't have any disagreements, but if you only have one version, you have to trust that the guy who compiled that one version got it right. And there were actually companions of Muhammad within the oral or within the traditional sources of Islamic literature called the Hadith that talk about the fact that there were particular individuals who were very close to Muhammad during his lifetime who did not want to give their Quran kind of versions to Uthman because they knew that theirs was going to differ with Uthman's and he would probably destroy it. And so you have these are not, I mean, controversial in the sense that these are part of the traditional Islamic sources in the Hadith. But I think within the history of how the Quran gets put together, you see something very different than what you see in the Bible. And so when you're reading it, especially if what I did, open up the front and then read all the way through, there are parts of the Quran that are confusing because they don't necessarily follow what would be considered a overly rational order in terms of the flow of the text. So I open it up, I read it. Some things sound familiar in some ways, and that it's talking about Moses and Noah and even, Jesus, Mary are in there. But there are components of it that they're so far from what the biblical narrative is that it just seems off. And I think there's a very
often in a sense that it's not chronological, where it's not in order. Is that what you mean? That's off, or
Well, the stories are very different a lot of the time. So,
Okay.
what I think we can derive from the historical record is basically that if you take the traditional Islamic narrative, Muhammad was illiterate. So he's not said to have been a learned individual. And so he is, if we take the traditional narrative once again, he's a caravaner in 7th century Arabia. And so he is going around Arabia in the Arabian Peninsula. He's going up into countries like what are today modern day Jordan.
what is this, Rob? Is this ChatGPT you pulled up, or
No, this was just Google.
Oh, okay, got it.
Yeah. So if we go by that traditional narrative, he's a caravaner, he's going around, he's being exposed to Christians and Jews because they're all over the place in Syria and in Jordan and in Iraq. Like these were Christian countries a lot of the time. And he's hearing these stories about who the Christians and the Jews believe are their prophets and individuals within that are part of the religion. But he's not able to discern between the difference between an actual historical source like, say, the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and, say, apocryphal Christian tales that are floating around the Arabian Peninsula. And so because there is this inability to actually discern between those sources, some of those things get incorporated into the Quran. So, and we can trace this. A friend of mine, Andy Bannister, did his PhD dissertation, and then he published a book on this. It's called The Oral Formulaic Construction of the Quran, where we can actually tie certain stories in the Quran to apocryphal sources that were floating around in the subsequent centuries after Jesus. So there's a document called the Infancy Gospel of Thomas, not to be confused with the Gospel of Thomas, which is very different. But the Arab Infancy Gospel of Thomas has a story where Jesus, the childhood Jesus, is making clay birds beside a riverbank. And the Jewish officials get mad at him because he's doing this on the Sabbath. He's breaking the Sabbath. They go off to get his parents to get him into trouble. And Jesus breathes on the birds. They turn into real birds and they fly away. So this is an apocryphal story. It comes centuries after the actual historical Jesus. It has no historical ties to the historical Jesus, but it's a popular story that's being incorporated into this infancy narrative.
In the Quran.
So the Quran adopts it. So we can trace it to the Infancy Gospel of Thomas and then the later Arab Infancy Gospel of Thomas. The Quran borrows it and incorporates it, but we know that it's not an actual historical story of Jesus. So when I say that there were stories that they're familiar.
So what's your point with that?
That there are stories that are familiar in that you're seeing the name Jesus. You're seeing the name John the Baptist. You're seeing the name Mary. But when you're reading these stories about them in the Quran, they're not stories they're not echoing biblical stories as much as they're talking about these characters in very different ways that if you don't know about, say, where these sources are coming from, if you're not looking into the infancy narratives, then you're like, well, what is this? Like, this is confusing. Is this more information? Is this right information? And so now later in life, in my formal education, digging into some of those things and figuring out, okay, well, here's how we trace those sources. Here's the paper trail. Here's how we can connect those dots between where potentially the author of the Quran was actually getting them from. That's when I did a lot of that legwork. But originally, I was reading the Quran and I found it unusual, but I also found it did not accurately reflect things that I was looking for to answer the ultimate questions. Questions of meaning and purpose and morality.
While you're going through it the first, second, or third time, are you sitting down with a Muslim scholar to debate and ask questions? Have you gone through that yourself? And if you did, what did you learn? Did you see contradictions? Did you see, okay, I understand this part?
Yeah, I would routinely meet with Muslims, especially in my university years. There were times where every Ramadan, my Muslim friends were reading the Quran, and so I would read the Quran alongside them. So we would read the entirety of the Quran during the time of Ramadan. And I would use that as an opportunity both to learn, but also to I wanted to be an example to them. So when you were talking about my attitude in the way that I approached my conversation with Billy, that's been my attitude all along, in that I'm part of an organization that does Christian apologetics, and apologetics
That's
is
the organization in Toronto you were talking about.
yeah.
Right.
So it's in Canada, Apologetics Canada. But apologetics is just a word that means to give it a reason or to give a defense, and it comes from a passage in 1 Peter 3:15, which says, "But in your hearts revere Christ as Lord. Always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have." But then it's the last part in that verse that I think is just as important. Not just be prepared to give an answer, but Peter says, "But in your hearts revere Christ as Lord. Always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks for the reason for the hope that you have. But do so with gentleness and respect, keeping a clear conscience, so that those who speak maliciously against your good behavior in Christ will be ashamed of their slander." And I think when we approach these conversations, whether we're talking to, agnostics, atheists, Mormons, Muslims, for someone like myself who claims to be a Christian, if I'm only giving answers, but I'm not revering Christ as Lord in my heart, and those answers aren't done so with gentleness and respect, keeping a clear conscience, then I'm not actually obeying that command in Scripture to give an answer, because it needs to be sandwiched in between those two things.
Yeah, I love that. Now with
Wow, that was a very beautiful discussion. Patrick Bet David asks questions about Islam, especially the Quran. And this man, spoke a lot about the Quran, the misunderstanding about the Quran, why people misunderstand the Quran, and what he love and respect so much about the Quran, comparing it to the Christendom, that is the Bible. He said yes, there are some similarities when it comes to Christian and the when it comes to Islam, the Bible and the Quran. But one thing that drew his attention mostly was about Prophet Muhammad being an illiterate and the things he did during his time. And he's just trying to let us understand why people misunderstand the Quran and why he found the Quran very, very peaceful, very, very powerful. Why he respect the Quran or respect Islam so, so much. And that was a very beautiful one. I just enjoyed every bit of this discussion. That was a very beautiful one. I really understood a whole lot from his explanation. And it's something that a non-Muslim can actually understand as a first timer. If you don't know anything about Islam and you listen to this video, you get one or two things from it. And that was beautiful. Let me know your point of view, guys. Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to smash the subscribe button for more. Like, share, and comment. I'll see you guys in the next one. Stay blessed. Bye.